I'm joined live now by Kristina Virro, psychotherapist.
Kristina, thank you so much for being on Cheaper Than Therapy.
And I have Kristina from Fresh Insight.
I'm a psychotherapist, and here are 3 reminders if you're dating right now.
And today we have Kristina Virro.
Welcome, Kristina Virro.
Kristina, welcome.
I'm going to say something, I don't know if people are going to find it controversial or whatever, but sometimes I encourage people to have what I call like a palate cleanser relationship. It might not be the relationship where there's fireworks left, right, and center. This might not be the relationship where you're having the best sex. I mean, you're still hopefully having good sex. It's a relationship that is stable and consistent and the person is nice.
Who do you think has higher expectations, men or women?
I think women do. I think women have higher expectations overall. The very good news is that we have some solid research about what predicts a relationship lasting or not.
If you had to summarize how you have helped people over the last decade, what would you say?
Oh man.
I know.
Man.
Loaded at the front.
My first question was like, have I helped people? Like the anxiety. Well, yes, no. I would say, how have I helped people? I think a theme across the board is just, regardless of what you're talking about, helping people become more aware of why they're experiencing something, how to get better at recognizing it, and then doing something different so that they can find a new behavior. That's the theme across the board. So once somebody's able to do that, it's really cool. And I find it really satisfying. We're at the beginning of that journey. They're like, and then I had your voice show up and tell me, maybe I shouldn't do that. And I'm like, okay. And then, eventually it becomes their own kind of inner therapist or whatever you want to call it. But that's really rewarding to see.
See that progression and that progress.
Yeah, like that pause between, I was going to do what I normally do, and then I did something different.
Right.
Yeah.
I've always been curious, and I think other people would be too, like, what are the most kind of common themes that you see as a therapist?
With dating or just like generally?
Just generally.
Just generally. I would say anxiety is a big one these days. Also, I'm finding right now a lot of kind of hopelessness just with how things are in the world, unfortunately. And then more broadly and more consistently, I would say relational issues in general. So with romantic partners, with a spouse, but also with family members, friendships. Relational issues cause a lot of grief in our lives, I think. They can also be such a source of joy, but it's a constant, I would say, around a lot of people that I work with.
Yeah, and I don't think it's not new news, but I think that the world in which we live in with technology and things like that is just further complicating it because of the fact that we're having to interact and build relationships in different ways.
Yes.
And so it adds this other nuance that, like, I feel like as humans, we're not necessarily used to. We might be good at adapting and like coping, but it is still, I think, new for us to be able to interact in those ways online and create those relationships.
Absolutely. 100%. Yes. And there's so many layers to the online world that's a whole can of worms, but yes.
Yes. So before becoming a therapist, what did you do? Like, how did you get into this?
Yeah. So, this therapy is my second career. So I was one of those people who had no idea what I wanted to do at all. So if anybody watching this feels that way, I've been there. And so all I knew was that I was really curious. So I started channeling that into journalism. So that was my first master's degree. And then I did a few things in the journalism world, but the one that particularly affected me as a therapist was when I worked with documentary films. There was one that I did that was about the opioid epidemic. And this was many years ago. Like, now it's obviously still going on. It's still really well known, but it was kind of before it was more talked about.
Right.
So I did a lot of interviews with people on all parts of that experience. So some of them had been the recovering addicts. Some of them had been parents who had lost a child, all these different people on the spectrum of that experience. And the interviews for documentaries are really long, right? Because you need a lot of footage and you get to know the people really well. You hang out with them quite a bit. And it was kind of strange because then the film was done and I was like, okay, thank you for your time. And I just never spoke to them again, right? And some of them I had on Facebook, and so I would see updates, but journalism was all about understanding the problem and reporting about the problem, the end. And so I was like, man, I wonder if I could actually help people with the problem. So that's what took me back to doing a master's degree in therapy.
Amazing. And so that was a big pivot, right?
Big pivot. Yep.
And at what point in your life, like, how long had you been doing journalism where then you decided to make this pivot?
Yeah. So I actually was quite young by the time I had my first master's degree. I'd skipped a grade. I did my undergrad really quickly. So I went to my second degree when I was 25.
Okay.
So yeah, but it was still funny because at that point there were I was always the youngest in every class that I was in, but at that point there were people younger than me in this degree.
Right.
And so I do understand that pressure of like a lot of people at 25 think about timelines and all these things and potentially settling down. And I was like, okay, I'm going back to school. So I am not on that timeline, but I found it very empowering. And I think it was actually good to teach me to not always stay on timelines because I mean, like, what do I ever look back and say, oh, how silly, I was 25? No, like I just think about what I accomplished from it. I never think about the timeline of it.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And I think timelines put a lot of pressure on us, and there's a lot of shoulds. And I always say like shoulds are shit.
Yeah.
Where it's like we think we have to at this age do this thing, get married, settle down. And I think there's a lot of pressure on us to do more at a younger age as well.
Yes.
And like we do live in this culture where we need to like continuously accomplish and, you know, do more. And when we do take that time to pause and really reflect, I know even for myself, I've thought about like, you know, the career that I'm in, the things that I'm doing, is this really what I want to do forever?
Yeah.
And so I think it's so admirable that you took that step to make that pivot. And I think that that can happen at any kind of stage in life.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was somebody in my class at the time who was 40 and she used to be a yoga instructor and she wanted to go back to school and it was awesome.
That's
you know, I had such respect. And it's so funny because I think so many of us would be like, oh, you know, if I were her, maybe I would be insecure about it. But all that we felt was admiration for it. So it's funny, that disconnect, right? Between how we judge ourselves and how other people see us.
Yes.
So funny. Yeah.
Yes. So the topic that I wanted to kind of get into with you today on is a hot topic, I think. As I mentioned when I posted about it, I got a lot of questions, feedback, and I think even so you're aware that I'm on this sober journey, and I have a app called I Am Sober, and that's where I like go on and share all my kind of deepest, darkest secrets and the things that are going on with me. And I had just a few weeks ago commented on I Am Sober and said like, dating is the absolute worst. I absolutely hate it. And it's, why is it this hard?
Yeah.
And I've never had such a strong response. Like, I think on average, maybe with those posts, you get like 30 responses. I got well over 100 responses, and everyone just basically saying like, me too, me too. And so I really wanted to talk about dating, and then we'll get into a bit about relationships as well. I joke that I've been doing research on dating for a number of years now, just because I've been single for a few years and dating. And I was just wondering, but from your perspective, what are the big picture items that are making it harder for us now to be satisfied in dating?
I think one thing that makes it difficult for us to be satisfied in dating is this paradox of choice, right? When you just have too many options and everybody is too accessible and you can be too picky and too selective. And I was on dating apps for an extremely short stint before I was in my present relationship, which is nearly 8 years. And I remember it feeling so icky to me. Like it felt like I was looking for a product on Amazon and I was like, I don't like this. It was a really odd feeling. Now I understand that some people have success on them, but I think that kind of dehumanizing people and looking at them that way creates a whole host of problems of detachment and criticism and just dehumanizing people.
Yeah, because people become this commodity, and like the same habits that I have picking up my phone and scrolling on Instagram can really be picked up and applied to any of the dating apps, where it's like I'll be on it and not even realize, and then I'm just scrolling through and completely forgetting to be intentional about what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, this paradox of options, like I think you can go on a date and it can go really well, and then there's always that thought or notion like, is there something better? And
absolutely.
And so I guess from your perspective, like, what would you say to people that are like going on these dates and might have that mindset where there could be something better? Like, how do they show up and be present and fully invest in it? Like, it's so much easier said than done. And I think we all rationally know that that's what we should be doing, but applying that is so hard.
Yes. I think that so many of us forget what a date is actually supposed to be. Like a date is, let me just go meet a person, let me feel their energy out, and let me then take it from there at the end. Right? It's not a marriage proposal. It is not, choosing the one. You don't have to make these humongous decisions after one date, but so many people do that. It's like before the date, oh my God, will this person love me? Is this person gonna be the one? And then after the date, was that person the one? It's like, holy moly, you met this person for 1 hour of your life, let's say 2 hours, whatever. Okay, so treat it that way, right? It's just a meeting of the minds, meeting of the souls. If you like them, okay, you like them based on a 1 hour conversation. Let's keep it at that for that particular minute,
Yeah.
It's so much pressure we put on ourselves.
So much, and we build it up. Like,
Yeah.
I know I've talked to someone online, gone on a date, and then exactly what you said, like, I built it up so much in my head that I'm like, well, is this the person? It's like, that was one interaction.
Yes.
And I almost go so far as to say, like, the first one's not even really a date. The first one's just meeting. The second one's the date, because if you connected and liked each other, then that second one is really where you've now agreed that, okay, there's something here. Maybe we actually go on a date.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
It's just this thought and theory that I have, because I think that we do just build up so much for that first interaction. I also wonder, like, do you think people are being overly ambitious? And so I think we, in today's day and age and culture, like, we're very invested in physical attributes, material things, like what is their job. Sometimes maybe our expectations are too high. And do these material and physical things, do they even matter in the grand scheme of things when we think about like a relationship that lasts?
Yeah. Do you know, it's so interesting that you asked that, because this is something I notice very frequently in session, is that somebody will tell me about a date. Let's say they had a first date, and they'll say, oh, he or she was this is what they do for work, this is what they looked like. And we can go a good chunk of time with them not saying anything about how they felt. It's like check, 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 check. And then, when you stop them and say, well, how did you feel? They actually are sometimes like, oh, but that didn't even occur to me to think about. So I'm thinking, to answer your question, are we too ambitious, and do those types of things matter, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what matters the most is just how we feel in a relationship, right? And I think we do pursue these material things, and we have this idea of more is more, but there is that thing of hedonic adaptation, which I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's basically when you get used to your new circumstances and they provide a new baseline. So to use a really silly example, if you're boiling hot and you go into a store and there's air conditioning, the first 5 minutes, you're like, oh my God, this is so nice. And then after 5 minutes, you kind of forget that you were hot 5 minutes ago, right? Because your baseline has now changed. Now you've gotten used to it. And I think that's actually very important to keep in mind, because I'm watching The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. I love trash TV, whatever. And something I was thinking about was, they have these humongous homes, but no matter what house they move into, the problems keep following. It's like, does it matter if you're in an apartment, or does it matter if you're in a mansion? No, if you have an unhealthy dynamic and you have an unhealthy relationship, the dynamic's going to follow you. Any insecurities are going to follow you unless you work on them, right? So I don't really believe this idea of, well, once we're in a bigger house, our relationship will improve. It doesn't really work like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think back in the day, I don't hear it so much anymore, but like, there was this thing like, well, if we just got married, if we just settled down, if we just had kids, like, everything will work out. And it's like,
oh gosh, that drives me nuts. The kids one especially. Like, I cannot think of something more irresponsible than trying to bond over a human life because you want to test your relationship. Like, no.
You're just bringing in someone else to the issues that
Yeah.
already exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're adding stress, right? Like, there's nothing more stressful than having a newborn and parenting and all that. So yeah, that one drives me nuts.
Yeah. But I almost think that today I kind of hear the opposite. So what I often hear is, everyone right now is on this, not everyone, but a lot of people right now are on this journey of like self-development, and they want to, like, they're going to therapy, they're improving themselves mentally, physically, spiritually, they're working on all these things. And I wonder if also, like, what's happening is everyone's like, well, I'm not ready yet because I'm still working on myself. And then is there a point where anyone's ever ready for it.
I totally hear you. So I think that there is kind of a baseline that you have to have within yourself of, like, let's say you're somebody who's undergone some sort of trauma and you're being triggered left, right, and center, and having a hard time with that. I do think for more acute issues and stressors like that, it's really important just for your own well-being to kind of get those sorted out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that you can kind of navigate life having some sort of consistency within yourself. But beyond that, I think that a lot of us experience healing in relationship with a safe person. So that's the caveat, right? And a lot of people, funny enough, that's kind of the point of therapy, is that you have a safe person who helps you feel a certain way that maybe you've never felt before, in terms of feeling secure, in terms of, we call it in therapy speak, unconditional positive regard. So no matter what you've done between last week and today, I'm still going to see you positively. I'm still going to encourage you and be compassionate and all those things, which some people have never experienced before, right? And so having that relationship is really healing for them. And I think it can be the exact same in romantic relationships, so long as you know that that person is providing enough consistency and safety for you, because it can also go the opposite way, right? Where you're with somebody who's unsafe and inconsistent and at the worst case abusive, and that's going to tear you down. But to say that you have to be this perfectly formed human being, I wouldn't put that pressure on yourself either. I mean, we're all kind of figuring it out as we go and doing our best, and a partner can really help you do that.
That's so interesting. I never thought about kind of like healing with someone. And I think it's easy for me to reflect on like the friendships that I have that have helped me get there. But then to think about a romantic relationship, I think then my mind's like, it kind of freezes and it's like, does not compute.
Yeah. And do you know, and I'm going to say something, I don't know if people are going to find it controversial or whatever, but sometimes I encourage people to have what I call like a palate cleanser relationship, where it's like, okay, this might not be the relationship where there's fireworks left, right, and center. This might not be the relationship where you're having the best sex. I mean, you're still hopefully having good sex, but it's a relationship that is stable and consistent and the person is nice. Like, sometimes I think if we've not experienced that and we write all of those people off, we never really know what that feels like. So a good palate cleanser, like, go for the steady person who's just kind and nice and good to you. Just see how it feels, take it for a test drive and then go from there.
Yeah. It's so funny you say that, because I think a lot of people listening will think like, well, I've tried that. I've tried to just go for the kind person.
Okay, yeah.
and I think that and then it's not successful or it doesn't work out. And it's like, well, I lowered my standards, or I just wanted to go for the palate cleanser and it still didn't work out. So like, what am I doing wrong? And maybe a part of that is, and this is kind of like a question for you, like, what qualities or characteristics in a partner would predict whether or not that might work out? Like, what things should people be looking for?
Yes. The very good news is that we have some solid research about what predicts a relationship lasting or not. So it comes from this man named John Gottman, and in the 70s he had this research study, and he had over 130 couples come in, and they just had different conversations, and they recorded them. They had heart rate monitors, they were measuring their sweat, like all of this stuff, and they followed up with them, I want to say over a decade later even, and they found that they could predict who was going to stay together and who wasn't with over 90% accuracy, which is very cool for us. So to answer your question, some of the things that they found, one predictor of a relationship not working is something called harsh startups. So it's when you start a difficult conversation very, very harshly. So am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yes.
Okay. So it would be something like, why the fuck did you leave your clothes around? You're such an asshole. That's obviously a really extreme harsh startup, versus a soft startup, which is, I've been noticing that we have a lot of laundry all over the place. Is it possible that we could talk about how we navigate that together? Super soft, super chill. It's not accusatory. It's team dynamic. So that was one predictor of whether or not a couple would work or not. The second was something called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So they said that if these 4 things are going on during arguments, you're very likely to separate or break up or whatever. So the first one was contempt. So that is seeing your partner as less than and kind of close to disgust, of like, you are unworthy and a despicable human being. So contempt, obviously. The second one was stonewalling. So that is when you basically completely shut down during a conversation, or your partner. Interestingly, what they did find was that people who stonewall typically actually have a lot going on internally. It's not like they're just like shutting you out. It's that they are so stressed sometimes, like their heart rates are elevated, they're sweating, they're just really panicked, some of them. So that was interesting and something to keep in mind. Like if your partner's shutting down, it might not be that they're not listening to you, it might be that they're overwhelmed. The third was defensiveness. So, oh, do you mind if you put the dishes away? Well, you never put the laundry away, right? And then the last one was criticism. So criticizing your partner, especially their character or their personality, rather than just keeping it about the problem. So those are some of the things that they saw. And then another one that I remember that they found was bad repair after a situation. So, I mean, for all of us, especially if you're with somebody for a long time, there's going to be moments where you miss the mark and where you upset each other. But if there's no repair attempt or no ability to kind of reconcile or come together after that, then that's obviously also going to lead to breakup over time, or resentment, or whatever it happens to be.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I think they seem obvious when you say them, but when you're in a relationship, it's really, I mean, all these things are so hard because your emotions are involved. And so then to rationally see whether or not these things are in a good place or a bad place, it's so hard. And especially at the beginning of a relationship where you're so infatuated with them, and then going back to like the session that you had talked about where someone's listing off, you know, they have a big house, they have a great job, they're 6 feet tall, like all these things. They're like, you're blinded by all of these other pieces in the checklist that you aren't maybe clearly seeing what it would actually take to have a long-term lasting relationship. So I wanted to read kind of a couple stats to you. So the first one is that 80% of women say that they want to date a man that's over 6 feet tall, but only 15% of men are actually over 6 feet tall. eHarmony found that over 40% of singles have deal breakers that have to do with physical appearance, and 50% of singles expect their partner to be their best friend, soulmate, and to fulfill all their emotional needs. And that was a study done by Match.com. And then just one other piece, in other generations, I don't know that these expectations necessarily existed. Like, I wonder if, like, you're finding in your practice that these expectations have evolved, and what does that mean for dating and relationships going forward? So like, are we looking at things differently? And I know we talked a bit about this already, but like, are our expectations such that we're just setting ourselves up for disappointment?
Yeah, I have so much to say about this question. So I do think that previously expectations were not as high, because I think our worlds were a lot smaller, right? Like we lived where we lived, we met with the people in our area, we didn't have all this technology to connect with people all over the world. So our worlds were a lot smaller. And I do think that our relationships were a lot more functional romantically. So, you know, somebody is a breadwinner, somebody is staying at home. So it was all kind of about that. Like, how does the system work as a unit? Now you've expanded our worlds a lot with technology. And I do think that women now, being quite successful, they don't really need the function of a breadwinner. So I made a video about this once that happened to go viral because I think it resonated with a lot of people. But I was talking about how heterosexual relationships especially are in a really weird spot, because women are now saying, okay, I don't really need the function of a breadwinner anymore because I can do that myself. But they're wanting an emotional connection that men still have not quite been socialized to provide, right? Because as women were growing up kind of being taught on how to be participants in the workforce and all of that stuff, I don't think the same was going on with men of like, let's nurture you to be emotionally intelligent, emotionally attuned, sensitive, communicative people. So now it's like, whoa, we have a huge gap here between what men have learned and where women are. And I don't think that that is men's fault. I'm certainly not saying, oh, you know, what's wrong with them? But no, I mean, they've been socialized the exact same way for many, many decades. And now I would imagine are probably feeling like, I don't really know how to do what you're asking for.
And do you think that that's challenging in that, like, now people just aren't finding a means in which to connect because the expectation is that you show up emotionally? Let's say the male is not there yet. And so that's where there's a bit of a clash. And
Yeah.
I also wonder, like, kind of second part to that is, I hear this notion sometimes where it's like, oh, well, women think they want a man that is emotional. And then when they get that, they reject it in some ways as well because it's too much or it's not, whatever, fill in the blank kind of thing. And so I guess my question is, like, we have all these thoughts about what we think we want, or like what you're saying, where there's actual, I don't know if it's science behind like the connection piece, but where are we getting it wrong? Like, because I see both sides of it.
Mm-hmm. Like in terms of women wanting somebody who's emotionally intelligent, but then men feeling like if they do show it, they aren't accepted. Is that
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of this stuff that we're talking about, it all occurs on a spectrum, right?
Mm.
Because even if we look at somebody who's emotional,
Mm-hmm.
there's a spectrum there. We want somebody who's emotionally intelligent and self-aware. We don't want somebody who's emotionally unhinged, right?
Right.
So that's the difference. And I have, worked with women who will be dating men where it's not that they're communicative and emotionally mature. It's that they're kind of emotionally off the rails in terms of like, you're now going to be my therapist and I'm going to just take up 2 hours of a phone call to talk about myself. That's actually not what we're looking for, right? I think what most people, women and men, are looking for is somebody who can say, I can read the room, I can act accordingly, and meet your needs to the best of my ability.
Yes. Okay. And I think that's the thing. I think that sometimes we view all of these subjects so black and white.
Yeah.
And we're not looking at the spectrum in which they all actually live and exist. A point you made there about like women making more money, but then there's still this notion that like men need to be the supporter, right? Like that still exists and persists. And then there was a stat that said, men often don't want to date women that outsmart them.
Mm-hmm.
Is this becoming an issue for successful women?
Well, I mean, I think I would say some men don't want to date a woman who outsmarts them. And if you're a successful woman, don't go after that type of man, right? I think it's fair for successful women. And, I've been there myself where I own a business, and I think I have a lot of masculine qualities of being very ambitious and that kind of a thing. So part of that, navigating that in dating, is bringing up these types of conversations early. I've said to some women on the first date or second date or whatever, say something along the lines of like, yeah, I kind of don't really like the traditional gender norms as much, and see what response you get, right? Because that's a good feeler question. If you have somebody who's like, oh man, I hope my women make me a sandwich every day, like, don't go after that type of guy, right? So okay, some men might want that, but make sure if you are somebody who values working and all of those things as a woman, that you're trying your best to kind of suss that out from the get-go.
And maybe like, do you think that's showing up as your authentic self? Like, and I guess again, that's probably on a spectrum, but when I go to the first date, like, I'm gonna like try and look my best. I'm gonna try and come off the best way I possibly can, because it's that first time interacting with someone, and I want that impression to be such that there's a second date. But then is there harm in showing up with too much of a mask? Because, and to your point, like, maybe there's value in showing up authentically even when they are things that you think someone may not appreciate or like, but so that way you ensure that the trajectory from there going forward is like showing up as you, like your authentic self, and you're connecting in that way.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like what we were talking about before, of coming back to this idea of what is the goal of a first date. It is a first impression, right? What is my first impression of this person? But I sort of say, and this is very unsexy, that dating is like data collection. Every date, you're just looking for a little bit more data of, okay, do I like that or do I not really like that? And not even in a judgmental way. Like, does that fit my worldview and how I want a partner to be, or does it not, for me personally? And you're not going to get that in one date. And this comes back to this idea of putting pressure on ourselves. That's going to take a number of dates and a number of meeting each other and seeing people in different contexts for you to understand that data, right? They might be one way with you one-on-one, and then you go with your friends, and who knows what they're like. So just allow yourself to trust the process of data collection as you go.
And speaking of data collection, how important is it to have certain values aligned? So like when I'm thinking about, the people that I'm meeting and when I'm going on these dates, like, do I need to make sure up front that we're aligned on children, religion, political views? Like, does that need to all be tabled right away? Or like, how important are those values in a longer term lasting relationship?
I think those are hugely important, really and truly. I mean, you have to align on the ones that matter to you the most. So, for example, you were talking about sobriety. That's a huge one. I mean, if you can you be with somebody who is not sober? You have to kind of check that out for yourself. And if that's a deal breaker of, okay, I have to be with somebody who's sober, you absolutely have to align on that. Because, and I would say, you don't need to figure that out again on the first date. You don't want to interrogate somebody and be talking about religion on date number one. But again, over the course of somewhere in the beginning, just doing some assessing around that, because it is really painful. And I'm surprised that I've seen this with people, if I'm honest, that they'll be married and then they're just finding out one person doesn't want to have a child. It's like, what the heck are you supposed to do at that point when you've been together for 13 years and you can't really compromise on that one, So I think we really have to be clear and honest about what our deal breakers are, what our deal makers are, and which ones we can kind of let slide, but what are the really important ones.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I was in a relationship for many, many years. To your point, we got engaged, and then we started having a conversation after 5 years of being engaged about whether or not we want children and how important that was to us. And we weren't aligned. And while I think like a breakup is never either black and white, it's kind of multi-pronged and there's different reasons for it. I think that was a major thing. And it was like, how did we not have this conversation 5 years ago about like what our expectations would be? So yeah, I think that's super important. I also wonder like, so are there, do you see like unrealistic expectations after a first date? And so what I mean by that is I think back in the day when we used to meet in person, we could like, there's a feeling, right? Like you would catch someone's eye and there was this like connection, and it wasn't fully physical, like just in terms of their appearance, but there was like a chemistry. And then I think now it's like you meet online and so you're interacting and like you could be having the same conversation with 4 or 5 different people, and then you get in person and you're like, oh well, I didn't feel that chemistry, so like this must not mean that it's gonna like that I actually like this person or that it's gonna last because I didn't feel anything. How realistic is it for someone to expect to feel something after like a first date or first few dates?
Yeah. I mean, I think you want to feel something after a first date. You don't want to go home and be like, wow, what a bore. I would never, you do want to feel some sort of chemistry, but do you need to feel like, oh my God, that was the best night of my entire life and that person just changed everything in my universe? I would say no, because that can also be just excitement. That can be lust. That can be just feeling like you're on the same wavelength with somebody. There's a lot of things that could be other than finding your soulmate, really, right? So I would say you want to feel something, but again, don't put the pressure on yourself to feel like your entire world has been changed after one meeting with somebody.
Who do you think has higher expectations, men or women?
I think women do. I think women have higher expectations overall, if I'm honest.
Yeah. And do you see women less kind of likely to pull back from those expectations, like to, I don't want to say lower the bar, but be more realistic about like what to expect in a partner? Or
Yes, because something I see quite a bit is people will go on this one date, and women typically, and then they will really kind of like critique it nitty gritty with a fine tooth comb. And it's like, oh, he said this one thing. Nope, I'm going to write him off, whatever.
the ick.
The ick. Oh my gosh, yes. And something I kind of recommend is to wait until there's a pattern, you know, about smaller things. I mean, about bigger things. If somebody is racist on your date, you don't need a pattern to be like, okay, no, I don't like that. But about things like, does this person take charge or not, right? So, okay, if the first date they said, can you pick the restaurant? Are they going to do that every single date? Okay, now that's a bit of a pattern, and then you can walk away. But what if the next date they're like, oh, because you planned the first one, I really want to plan the second one. And let's say they did a really good job planning the second one. Like, would that change things for you? Right? So just wouldn't say be so quick to write people off immediately. Just see if there's a bit of a pattern first.
Yeah. And that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of these things, like you say them and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. But we get so caught up in like just these ways of doing things and never stopping and reflecting and then changing, kind of like what you said at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Like,
and I do think, just on that note, what's been interesting is that I think what's come with social media is that we're kind of seeped in other people's values and preferences. So, for example, like, okay, maybe I don't really care very much if a guy plans a date, but then I go on TikTok and I land on some side of it, and all of the women are like, oh my God, I can't believe he didn't plan the date. What a loser. He's so lazy. Am I now going to be like, oh my gosh, maybe it does matter? Whereas that didn't matter to me 10 minutes ago. Right. So I think there's so much noise that sometimes it can be really easy to lose what we actually care about, lose sight of that.
would you recommend people write a list of the things they want in a partner?
Well, yes, but I think there's a difference between wants and needs, right? Do I want my partner to be 6'4"? Yes. Do I need him to be 6'4"? Maybe not, right? But maybe I do need somebody who's respectful. I hope that that's more of a need than a want. So, maybe framing it that way as well.
Interesting. I want to go back to something you had said about healing in a relationship. Mm-hmm. So I was doing some research before, obviously, this podcast interview. And there's this one exercise where, they would say, write down a list of the things that you bring to a relationship, write down a list of the things that you want in a partner, and then compare that list and see where there's matching and then where there's not a match. So like for me, things like patience, being calm, that like I want a partner that I don't have. And then they said, take those and work on those pieces. So that way you're not, let's say, like looking for the relationship, like filling gaps in yourself by someone else. Mm-hmm. And so how does that maybe differ from what we had talked about at the beginning in terms of like using a relationship to heal and grow?
Yeah. I really like that exercise because I do think it's fair to say that many of us it's so much easier to demand things of others than to demand things of ourselves, right? But yeah, in terms of like how you can grow through another person, I think there is something to be said for sometimes like learning from another person in terms of where they do differ. Because if you're not patient, okay, you can do a little bit of work on yourself, but there's something very powerful about being with somebody who is patient and having a felt experience of what that's like, right? Versus kind of knowing it, but then when you feel it, it's very, very different. So having those felt experiences, I think, can really make us better people in terms of, okay, now that I know how that feels, maybe I'll be a little bit more likely to give it.
Yes. Yeah, it's like the theory of versus like actually feeling it, and also seeing someone how they like operate in that space of calm or patience. Like I can learn a lot more and a lot faster from seeing it in someone else than me like, okay, actually be patient, like telling myself.
It's so true. Witnessing somebody do something in real time is a really good educator.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you had to make assumptions about someone who continuously dated people that were wrong for them, or continuously had one-night stands or chose people that were not interested in them, what would your assumptions be about that person's backstory?
Well, so there is a concept in the therapy world called transference, which is basically when a client of a therapist has all of these unconscious needs and desires and unfulfilled wishes from when they were a child, and they sort of put those onto the therapist in the real time. And there's a theory that we do that in relationships, even romantically, where if you have some unmet needs, you might unconsciously be choosing people where you can kind of finish the story from when you were a child, right? So let's say you had a dad who was really distant. You might be more drawn to people who are that way as well. A, because it's also very familiar, which I think we subconsciously like, is that familiarity and comfort. But B, because there could be some transference going on of maybe if I can figure this relationship out, then I've sort of healed what happened to me then. So I think if somebody was doing that, I might sort of ask, like, who did you not feel close to as a child? Because that could be kind of revealing. And I would also look into attachment. That could go anxious or avoidant, that one. And we can talk about that if you'd like. But I would also kind of inquire about some relational trauma that's happened, even if it was in their teenage years or university. Let's say they had a really traumatic experience with sexual assault. I mean, that's probably going to affect how they're relating to people now and dating and wanting to have a guard up. So I would kind of be looking into, my first thoughts would be, okay, what relational trauma has happened? What was this person's caregiver like when they were growing up? I'm assuming somebody who was probably inconsistent or unreliable in some way. And that's where I would start.
What are the attachment theories?
So attachment theory is based on this idea that the way that our caregivers were with us when we were children impact how we relate to adults now. So there's a few different styles that people had. So there's different names, but one is an anxious attachment style, one is an avoidant attachment style, one is a disorganized attachment style, and then one is a secure attachment style, which is what we all kind of want. So a secure attachment style is you can be both dependent and independent. You can be affectionate, you can be loving, but you can also receive love and care. And there's like a lot of balance and consistency in the relationship. With an anxious attachment, there's a lot of what would be called clinginess, being really, really afraid of the relationship dissolving, making a lot of attempts to keep that person close. And there typically, as the name suggests, is a lot of anxiety for that person. And then an avoidant attachment style is somebody who veers the opposite way, where they really value their independence. They don't actually like being very close. The closeness feels very anxiety provoking for them. And so they will kind of sometimes make these attempts to stay away. Which probably is more so in that situation that you mentioned of somebody who's having a lot of one night stands and picking people that's, I would say that there's probably a more avoidant person.
Do you see that certain attachment styles end up together? I'm just thinking like of friends, and then even reflecting myself, like I think I fall more under avoidant where I'll pull away, but I'm used to being with someone who is anxious. Yeah. So continuously chasing, and then if someone's not providing that chasing, then I'm like, well, they must not like me because they're not trying.
The most common thing that I see is an anxious coming with an avoidant. But what I was going to say is that I think two avoidants are the hardest to work with in therapy.
And is there hope for, so I'm guessing not a majority of the population is secure in their attachment style. And so there's probably a lot of us that are anxious or avoidant. And so is there hope for us, and recognizing that things might not be, perfect right away, but like working with someone like you, working in therapy, like, is there hope for those relationships? Or is it just destined to fail because you don't have a secure partner in the mix?
No, I think a huge myth is that our attachment style is permanent. It really can change, and they've done some really cool research about it. So, for example, there was one study that was done that looked at some attachment styles in children, and then they followed up with them again later. And there was one kid, for example, who had started as an avoidant attachment, but then he went into a foster care system, but had a really good experience. Like, he got paired with a family that was really, really loving, and his attachment style later was secure. So I think that's important to note, because something I do see is, now that we have awareness of this language, I see a lot of people diagnosing each other of like, oh, well, I went on this date and the guy was super avoidant. And it's like, ooh, like, give it a minute. Maybe you two can be really good for each other. Maybe you can learn techniques together. And it's not always so cut and dry. So they can certainly be changed. You just need to learn the right skills, and then you can create that secure base for each other, and then have that secure attachment.
That's so interesting that you say about like the language, that we all have this language and we all have so much access to information and we're downloading it constantly, but we're not always using it in the right way. And sometimes it can create more harm than good, right? Like, then you don't go on that second date because you've written this person off for XYZ reasons, but you never even gave it a chance, and it could have been something great.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of things that people could be kind of like insecure about or worried about going into a relationship. What if one of those things is fear of intimacy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's this really interesting term that's called the beautiful mess effect. And basically, it's this phenomenon where when we're vulnerable with somebody, we think that we're being weak, but other people experience it as bravery. And I think just knowing that is very, very empowering. And if you think about your own experience, I would probably guess that that's true for you. right? Like if you have a friend, let's say, who never opens up to you, who never talks about themselves, that's probably not going to harbor much closeness, right? Because you leave and you're like, well, we just kind of talked about the weather and superficial crap. Whereas I find that vulnerability begets vulnerability, right? Like once one person kind of opens that door a little bit, it kind of gives the other permission to do the same. And then it kind of creates this positive impact of, okay, we can both do this together and create that safety for one another. I heard somebody once say, if you want to write an unlikable character, you make them perfect, which is true. It's knit, right? Like if I think about my own experience, even with my stupid reality TV shows that I watch, the people that have layers and are vulnerable are the ones that you kind of are drawn to and that you have a connection with. So I think it's the exact same when it comes to intimacy in a relationship and just reminding yourself like this is something that brings closeness.
Yeah. So when you say that, I can completely relate because I think also like in my sobriety journey, I really fully learned what it meant to be vulnerable, like to sit in a room and tell people your deepest, darkest secrets and then be met with like the most love and kindness and someone across the room that says me too. And like, and there's so much magic in that. So I'm a big believer of vulnerability and connection. I guess the other end of the spectrum is like, I go on social media and every female male is like perfect body. It looks from the outside like they have the perfect career, the perfect this, that. And so when we think about intimacy, it's like, well, I'm not showing up perfect because no one is. And so I can come to terms with that fact and get vulnerable. But what if like on the other side of it, there's also that expectation because that's what they're seeing? Like, do you think that people expect perfection because that's what they're seeing?
Well, then you don't have to date that person.
Yeah.
If you go on a date with somebody who expects perfection, I'm like, all right, bye.
Yeah.
Ain't going to happen right here. But I think, you know what, though, to the question before of like, okay, what do you do if you have this fear of intimacy? I sort of liken it to exposure therapy. This is new, right? And for a lot of people who have a fear of intimacy, it is extremely legitimate. So maybe they've had a really, really bad experience or whatever it happens to be. So I don't think it makes sense to say, well, now I'm just going to go expose my whole soul. Like, please don't do that, right? Because we want to make sure we know that the person's going to receive it well. And we also don't want to go so far that you re-traumatize yourself. So there's little things that you can, what I would sort of suggest people do if you're listening is come up with some small ways that you can be vulnerable on a date. So for example, your idea of I go on a date and I don't have a drink. That's a huge step into vulnerability for a lot of us, even if we don't have an addiction, right? To just not need any liquid courage. Maybe you go on a date and you don't wear as much makeup. There's a lot of ways that you can just expose yourself to a little bit of vulnerability in a way that feels safe for you. And then you can kind of see what that feels like for you and go slowly, you know, and working with a therapist on that is helpful because then you can kind of download what happened and talk about it and sort of discuss next steps. But so I would say like, it's okay to validate that fear and do it anyway in the spirit of courage, right? It's like I've heard this expression of real but not true. You can have a feeling that's real, but that doesn't mean it's true.
I love that a lot because I think again this black and white thinking, it's like, well, if I go into the date and then something happened, like this evolves over time and then we do get physically intimate, like what's that going to look like? And then there's this huge leap from like day one and then I'm freaking out about that. And to your point, it's like, well, but I can be vulnerable in small little ways, like less makeup and things. Like I absolutely love that. And even with physical stuff, you can be vulnerable of, okay, maybe you just make out for the first date and then you stop for yourself, and set yourself up for success there. Like maybe don't go to their place if you know what I mean. Like if you feel like you're going to be tempted to go to the next stage, but then it's going to be too overwhelming for you. Like you can even go slowly with physical intimacy as well, just to see how it feels on the way. But yeah, we want to do it gradually and safely. Is there such thing as getting physical too soon? I mean, it depends on the person, right? Like, I mean, I've worked with many people who have said, I've learned about myself that if I'm physical too soon, it's too distressing. I feel as though I am too attached and then I really, really get worked up. So for those people, there is such a thing as getting physical too soon. For other people, it's really liberating to have sex early on and that works for them. But you have to know your own body and what feels right for you. Right. Okay. I want to just jump into a bit. I know we've talked a ton about the dating. Mm-hmm. I want to jump into a bit about like romantic relationships. And you had wrote an amazing article, I don't know if you remember, about feeling insecure in romantic relationships. And I'll just like give a bit of an anecdote. Like, and so I had said I'm avoidant, and the thing is that as soon as something starts turning into something where I think like this is actually good and like, you know, this could actually be something, I get so scared. And I read what you wrote about being insecure in romantic relationships. So like losing maybe a bit of your identity, getting to enmesh, like things like that. Could you speak a bit about that article? Just because I think it was so, so powerful.
Do you know, I don't remember the article.
No?
You're going to have to help me out here.
Yeah.
I'm glad I was wise when I wrote it. I'm sure it's floating around in there, but I might need some more pointed questions there.
So it was about, so like you had talked about not losing yourself, like in the relationship, and so like maintaining a bit about like that. You also talked about the attachment styles, which we already talked about, so like figuring that piece out, and then feeling and then you had also talked a bit about vulnerability and things. So like we did discuss some of them, but I think that the thing that really stood out for me the most was like being able to maintain a bit of your independence, and like you talked about like maintaining your own friendships, and I think going back to an earlier question about how we expect partners to be everything to us now, and I think you talked a lot about this in the article too, where it's like we want them to be our best friend, our romantic partner, our career coach, our therapist, like all of these things in one. And I have my own kind of like thoughts and notions about that, but it's just
I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the time when I see somebody very, very anxious in a relationship, I have some warning signs of like, okay, where are you? Where have you gone? It's like the more anxious they get about the person, the more I lose them a little bit, you know? And so I'll often say in those moments something like, when was the last time you saw your friends? When was the last time that you did something that you really enjoy? When was the last time that you did something on social media, not because you wanted them to see the post and you wanted them to give you a call, like just because you wanted to post it? And so I think we do have to be very conscious of making sure that we as an individual are filling up our own cup so that we aren't so anxious about somebody else doing that job. And it is true what you mentioned of, I think it is completely unfair to expect one human being to fill every single cup that you have, to be your social outlet, to be your emotional support, to be the best lay you've ever had, to have the most thought-provoking conversations you've ever had at one time, right? Like in any relationship that's healthy, those are all going to kind of wax and wane at any given time, because that's what being a human is. And so, you know, maybe your partner is really stressed out at work, and that's when you need to call your girlfriends and have a night out. But I think we really need to normalize that a little bit more, rather than this idea of like, well, my partner didn't meet my one need on that one Thursday morning. It's like, yeah, that's, you know, that's part of it. It's going to happen, and that's okay. They're trying their best, and you wouldn't want that to be put on yourself, hopefully.
Well, when you talk about that, like, I think we've talked a lot about like how, and I guess the reality is we can only control our own actions and our own thoughts. And like in sobriety, it's like keep your side of like the lane clean, I think is the saying. Like just focus on yourself, don't kind of look at what everyone else is doing. And so like how do we stay out of this mess of wanting them to show up in the same way? Like I think for me it's like, okay, I do like, you know, therapy, I have these type of conversations, I listen to podcasts, like I'm doing all the work on my end, but then I show up on a date or like in a relationship and like the other person is not anywhere kind of close to like that type of self-actualization. And so like, do we just like cut them off? Do we go on a journey with them? Like I guess I wonder, and like maybe this is me being a little too altruistic, but like how do we take everyone on a journey with us to be better humans and like work through a bit of the messes? Okay, not the red flags, but a little bit of like the things that are a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, I personally think that a really, really important quality in a partner is somebody who is open. And so I think the difference is they have to be open generally to self-improvement and self-growth, but that can look like how they want it to look. That could look extremely different from how you want it to look. You know, I might be somebody who loves podcasts and self-help books and things like that. My partner might not be into that, but so long as they're open to things like that is what I would kind of pay attention to if you're dating. If you're with somebody who's just closed off to everything, no, I don't like talking about self-improvement, I don't want to work on myself, I think that's a huge red flag. So, okay, are they open to just concepts like that when you talk about them? Are they interested? And that doesn't mean they have to take them on, but are they kind of open to the idea of self-growth and self-discovery? you know?
Yeah. Okay. I want to just run through a couple questions that I got from the community. And I had put out a post, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, just like in terms of dating and relationships, and if anyone had questions. And so I kind of took like the top few that I most commonly got. So the one question that I got the most is obviously from people I think that are in relationships. But can a man and woman truly just be friends? And like, what are the rules around like being friends with the opposite sex? And someone even asked about like, can I be friends with my ex? So yeah, multi-layers to that question.
I personally feel as though men and women can be friends if there's some sort of inherent boundary in place. Like if you're both in a relationship, I feel like that's a lot easier. I personally think that men and women cannot really be friends. If they're both single, I just think it gets kind of murky of signals being crossed, or somebody might have feelings for the other one. But I think it's different if you're like, okay, I have a partner and you have a partner and now we can, but there's a boundary that's already there, right?
Yes. Yeah.
There was a second part to that question.
It was just more around like, can I maintain a friendship with my ex?
Oh, can you maintain a friendship with your ex? Well, I think you can maintain a friendship with your ex depending on how you still feel about them. Right. You know, I mean, I know of people who it took maybe 10 plus years of not seeing the person, and emotions were lower, things had dwindled, they had both moved on. And so that they could be friends, and that was fine for them. But, you know, if you're thinking about your ex and you want to punch something, like maybe not, I wouldn't recommend it. Or if you feel like that's just going to open a can of worms for you that you don't really want to look at. And just like speaking about sobriety, it's all like, I've used this analogy with people of like, okay, if part of your sober journey is like, I can't go to a bar again, it's like, okay, is part of your healing journey that you just can't see your ex again, because that's always on the table.
Okay. So this question I really, really liked. How do you know when someone is being genuine with their feelings for you?
Oh man. Well, I think part of knowing if somebody's being genuine, maybe people will find this helpful or not at all, is that usually we have some sort of a gut feeling. I really do think so. I find what can happen is that we then try to intellectualize our feeling or dismiss it or whatever. But honest to God, even people I've worked with who stay in a relationship that's bad, if I ask them, did you ever have a feeling? They'll say, yep, 100%. It's just sometimes we don't listen to it for whatever reason. So I would say trust your gut. But I do think that this is where it comes back to what we were talking about before, data collection, right? You are not going to know. I think what's really hard about dating is that we all like certainty. Right? We like to know all of the answers at any given time. We want to know right from the bat, is this person going to be in my life for a long time? Are they a good person? And those are huge questions. And sitting in that uncertainty of not knowing is really hard. That's the hardest part. But the best that we can do is say, I'm going to let myself figure that out slowly. So, you know, okay, like, see if every single time they're sharing their emotions, you're sort of seeing some conflicting evidence, or every single time they're sharing your emotions, you're like, oh, this doesn't feel right. Then over time, just trust that feeling. But you're not going to know the answers to these huge questions in one date or one interaction, which is what all of us think that we can do. So let's just break that balloon or whatever, break that bubble. Like, all of this stuff takes time with dating. It's part of the process. We can't rush it. It's just an area you cannot rush, you know?
This is so good. I think my biggest takeaway through this is like, it's like the reality is we're putting so much weight on one date and like one interaction. And like, I'm hearing all the things you're saying. And I think that there's also like a lot of knowledge out there, right? So it's like, I did the research, and I know everyone has all these high expectations around like physical appearance and material things. And so then I try and pull back from that myself. And I'm like, well, in my dating, I'm not going to pay attention to those things. I'm really going to just focus on personality and values, because I know that that's important. But then, to your point, it's like, well, I also am like, oh, but I have this gut feeling that like this person isn't right. There's something weird about this. There's something that I just feel like isn't right. But I'm focusing on all the right things, which is like values, and we have all these connections. And like, I'm putting myself in the same position. And then, because what I'm doing is then lining up all of the data, ignoring my gut, and then showing up on the first date and wondering why it doesn't work out. Right. And it's like, and then I'm all like hurt because like, oh, that didn't work out. And it's like, Ashley, you put so much into like so much weight into like one date, like one interaction with one human being. And I think we all probably could benefit from like pulling back from that a little bit and not putting all that weight, because it's a process, like you said.
And have fun with it, you know, like don't take it so seriously. You know, it's so tempting to do, and trust me, I have been there. But if you just can kind of have some humor about it, okay, you go with somebody and it's an absolute dud, whatever, you had a drink that night and the life will go on, right?
Yeah.
So taking it with a grain of humor and not taking it so seriously, I think is just super important as well.
I love that. If I could just go in with the intention of like, I want to have fun, then at the worst case scenario, you spent a Friday night having fun.
Or you have a hilarious story. Even if it was a god awful date, you have a fun story to tell your girlfriends about, and the world will keep spinning and everything will be fine, you know?
I want to try something with you. We'll see how it works. But I wanted to do like a rapid fire, but I wanted to do it in like, is this a red flag?
Oh, I love that. Okay.
So, is it a red flag if they send you selfies all day?
Yes. But this is just me. If you're also taking selfies all day, you might be like, yes, you know, so that's fine. I'm just saying for me. This is me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm agreeing with all of this. The cadence of their messaging changes.
No.
No.
For me, no. There could be so much going on, you know?
Yeah.
Busy work day, whatever.
He wants to split the bill, or she.
Date one, call me old school. Yeah. After date one, no. No, I wouldn't say that's a red flag, though. I wouldn't be like, woof. I would just be like, oh, okay, that was interesting. So, no, probably still not a red flag.
Yeah.
But just maybe not my preference.
Has cheated in a previous relationship?
Depends. I kind of want to know why. I don't know. See, I've really learned that so many things are not black and white. So I would just be like, well, why? You know, if they had been out to lunch for 10 plus years and we're not meeting any of your needs, I'm not saying cheating is okay, but it's like, okay, I could understand that.
Yeah. And the fact that they're telling you and coming like, forward with it shows like a level of maturity, honesty, like being forthcoming.
Depends. Yeah.
That's all I had, but I know we have a few minutes. I just want to see, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think would be really important to include?
I am trying to think. You know, one thing I was thinking about is just how we were talking about what's the point of a date. I also think something that's really easy to forget is just dating. Like if you think about what dating is, it's basically failing until you don't. That's dating, right? Like, isn't that funny when you think about it? So, I mean, it's part of the process to fail over and over and over. That's just kind of what comes with the territory. And then eventually you hope that you find your one person. But I think that that's kind of helpful in the spirit of not taking it so seriously. Like it's part of the game, for lack of a better word. It's part of the journey is that you're going to keep falling and falling and falling and falling and falling until you do actually hopefully fall in love. But it's very easy for us to think that we have failed when a date doesn't work or something, and it's like, no, that's what dating is. You're doing it right if you keep, you know, the goal is to find something hopefully permanent, but in the end that's just part of the process. I don't know if I articulated that in any way that makes sense.
It 100% makes sense. And I think like I mean, my interpretation of it, whether or not it was your intention, is like also we need to keep doing the things that make us happy, like show ourselves self-love, because to your point, it's not that we failed, like we didn't bring enough to this, that interaction just didn't work out. And not to put all your eggs in like this dating basket or a relationship working out, like continue to invest in yourself, in your friendships, in other relationships and things like that, so that way, like, you know, you're still a full person, and this is just another piece that you're working on. And to your point, like, okay, fail until you don't, right? And like that's the whole point of dating. And it's not this serious like, are we going to get married after one interaction? It's just about like, go have fun, you have some stories to bring back to those friendships that you're continuing to nurture, and that's it.
And like just on that note too of not taking it personally, like I kind of joke that, okay, I don't like tomatoes, right? And so if I know this sounds cheesy, but okay, if Gordon Ramsay made me a dish that was only tomatoes, I would still be like, I don't like it. Okay, he's a Michelin star chef, and I would just say, you know what, I just don't like tomatoes. It's nothing against Gordon Ramsay. So I know it sounds cheesy, but you can't forget that when you're dating, right? It actually isn't always personal. Like, what am I supposed to do with the fact that I don't like tomatoes?
Right. You don't have to internalize all of it.
No, you don't have to internalize it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Welcome.
I
Thank
appreciate
you.
this so much. And
me too. Yes, me too.
Yeah, it was amazing. Amazing conversation.
Good.